the beauty in my experience in teaching contract classes has always been very fascinating for me. I have such a joy and a passion for it because I understand the dynamics of what these contracts can do for us. This is what pays commission, folks. So knowing how to diligently, effectively understand the timelines of events, the understanding, because this is what makes deals happen, and this is also what makes deals cancel as well. But having a good understanding, and for many of you on the call, how do you become an effective negotiator and understanding how these contracts are drafted? Now, one thing that I would stress the fact, folks, is be clear and concise and do not leave any blanks, because this form is no different than a resume. Think about it. If you were to go for a job interview, right, and you had your resume complete and you're ready to go on an interview, you want to showcase your ability by really detailing your resume. This is the same when it comes to the purchase agreement, because remember, this offer is going to be presented to a listing agent and a seller. And if you're working the high-end market, or you're working with a listing agent that has many, many years of experience, believe me, I hear it, I see it, and I know that agents talk. If this form is incomplete, inconsistent, and just doesn't make any sense, or there's too many errors or mistakes, guess what's going to happen? Your offer is going to be put to the side. Because remember, this is like a relationship that you're going to be involved with in the next 30 to 45 days. It's a make it or break it pretty much transaction. You know, for me and some of the top agents in my office, that's one of the components that they really dissect, is how complete is this offer? Is it missing any information? Is the information on here correct? Even misspelling is also a crucial component to your success as well. As I mentioned earlier, before we had the issue with the internet, there's 32 bullet points on the RPA, and that's now. When I started 23 years ago, there was probably 18 or probably 15 different languages on the RPA. And guess what? 10 years from now, it'll probably be, 45 different paragraphs that ultimately create this RPA. So as we progress year in and year out, believe me, these contracts get modified, get tweaked by the association and by the attorneys that create these forms. So one, you always want to have the latest purchase agreement. This one in particular, as an example, is the revised of December 2018. This is the most current RPA. Why is it important to have the current information? Is because there's case studies, there's litigations, there's arbitrations, and there's lawsuits that ultimately drive these forms to be modified. If it's not the RPA, it can be contingency forms, it can be disclosure forms. This is why it's important to listen to the broker of your company and take the guidance of what the current California Association of Realtors current forms. All right, so residential purchase agreement, as I mentioned, this is the form that strictly focuses on single family residence, duplex, triplex, and fourplex, okay? If you're gonna be doing commercial, then this is not the form to use. If you're gonna be doing any type of units such as duplex, triplex, or fourplex, this form can be used, but I highly recommend that you use the RIPA form, which is the Residential Income Producing Purchase Agreement. There's also manufacturer purchase agreement. There's also vacant land purchase agreement. There's also business opportunity purchase agreement. But for the sake of today's class and lecture, we're going to focus on SFR, single family residence, okay? This is the form that is necessary to accomplish the goal of getting this offer considered, accepted, and then ultimately open up escrow. Now, if you haven't taken any classes through the association or your market center, one is obviously your transaction, your ZIP forms. This is strictly from the California Association of Realtors. This is what provides you with the contracts that are necessary to be an efficient and the arsenal and tools that you need in order for you to draft these contracts. So all I did was go into my ZIP account and just created the form. This is not the class for it. We're just going to focus on the purchase agreement. And I'm going to go through some key components to the form and why these forms are very sensitive to the nature and why we use the specific language to get our voices to our client's position. So the first page goes through the dynamics of who the person submitting the offer, what does the offer entail, what is the price, what are the terms and conditions, what are the finance, what are the deposits. So the first thing is up here which says date prepared. Okay, that's the date that this form was actually created. So for the sake of argument today, I use as today as the platform, January 11, 2021. This offer is obviously created and the purpose is for the buyers, which I use Mr. John Smith and Mrs. Angelica Smith, who are the buyers purchasing a property on 123 ABC Street, Los Angeles, California, 90023. It's in the city of Los Angeles, and it is the county of Los Angeles. So I would put in here as well that it's the county of Los Angeles. Okay. Now, the parcel number, or better known as the APN number, consider this as a social security number, meaning that the parcel number identifies a specific property. Even if you didn't have the address put on here, for example, 123 ABC Street, you can still identify a property based on the APN number. So here's a very crucial element to this, that you need to make sure to double check, triple check that the APN number identifies the subject property. Okay, and how do you do that? It's very simple. You go into your multiple listing service and you go into your realist or your tax profile, and that's where you're going to be able to identify the address, which is the subject property, and the APN number. Okay, I've seen litigations and lawsuits against this particular situation here on the APN, and I'm going to explain why. There was an incident maybe about 5 years ago where we represented the seller, and the seller had an adjacent piece of land. So they had their home, and they also had a parcel vacant land adjacent to the property, two different APN numbers. The house had one particular APN number. The vacant land had a different APN number. When the offer was submitted, even though on the MLS, ladies and gentlemen, on the MLS, and then also on the counter offer, the listing agent stressed the fact that it is only the single family resident that was being sold, not the APN. But on the tax realist, for some reason, it looked like it was incorporated between the two APN numbers, meaning when you looked at it, it looked like the seller was using one tax to pay both different APN numbers. So what ended up happening was, because the offer was submitted with the vacant land APN number and not the house APN number, the escrow officer and even title assumed that the buyer was buying both properties. And it wasn't until after it recorded transfer of ownership that they realized, oh gosh, we just sold both the vacant land and the house as a combination together. And the buyer had two pieces of land, the single family residence and also the vacant land. And that's what opened up the lawsuit, because the seller did not want to sell the vacant land. That was another $200,000 worth of value that the buyer just basically got for free. And that's what ultimately got the attorneys involved. And it was not something that the listing agent did anything wrong, because we covered our basis. The problem here was that the escrow officer and the title company presumed that both properties, because it was in both the seller's name, that it was going to be incorporated as one transaction, and the buyer was going to take the single family residence, including the vacant land. And that opened up the lawsuits and back and forth, because the buyer says, wow, you know, and the ironic story is the buyers knew. The buyer knew that the property or the vacant land was not included as part of the sale. But when that happened, now the buyer was fighting to say, well, you know, this is my property now. If you want it, I'll sell it to you. And that's what ultimately caused the lawsuit. And literally, it took about 2 years to settle. Ultimately, the buyer and the seller came to an agreement and a compromise that unfortunately, the buyer sold the property at a discount, but wanted compensation for it. And yeah, you know, it was a very unique situation. The escrow company was sued. The title company was sued. And the buyer and the sellers were in dispute regarding this as well. So it was a big situation that ended up happening. And, you know, ultimately 2 years later, the seller ended up retaining back the vacant land. So, ladies and gentlemen, I can stress the fact that what is very important is that you make sure that the APN number coincides with the offer and the address. And it's just doing a little bit of research and making sure that the address coincides, again, as I mentioned, with the APN, because that will give you a perspective. If there's any issues, at least you can immediately you know, figure out, hey, wait a minute, the APN does not match this address and there's something wrong, and that's when you can address the situation. Unfortunately, that particular scenario did happen, and there was a lot of people that dropped the ball, and ultimately that was the end result, a lawsuit. And we were dragged into as well, even though the sellers did not blame the listing agent, you know, we still had to represent and provide additional information. So again, make sure that the APN number, identifies the subject property. Now, the purchase price is obviously $850,000 as an example, so make sure that the close of escrow and the dollar amount coincides to whatever you're going to be or your clients are submitting the offer. Typically, you do have two options. You can either do option one here, where you can actually put the date of close of escrow, or more so where a lot of agents, they just put 30 days here. Part two talks about the agency, the confirmation, okay? I use the listing agent as Clown Realty, the license of the corporation, and then obviously Tom Cruise, who is the listing agent. And then I use Keller Williams as the buyer's agent and myself as the agent representing the buyer. And who are the buyers? Mr. John Smith and Mrs. Angelica Smith, okay? Now, the finance aspect of the first page, this is the most important elements to the purchase agreement, is the 2 pages, the first page and the second page, and then also the third page. And as we progress through this, the importance of understanding what agents are looking for, because for me, with many years of experience, you know, I already know what I need to look for and make a determination if this is an offer that, you know, is good to, you know, have the seller consider, or is this an offer that we're going to ultimately counter, or is this an offer that we're totally going to reject as well, okay? So the finance aspect of it is important, but more so is, what is the initial deposit? Typically, right now, because it's a seller's market, very low inventory, what we're seeing in a high demand of buyers qualifying with these low interest rates, we're seeing a hike of multiple offers on the table, meaning there's one listing and there can be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 offers on one particular property. So how do you showcase your ability to present the best offer? Going back to what I mentioned earlier, it's all about the avenue and how you approach your dialogue, your conversation, but more so how clear and concise these contracts are, and making sure that you fill in everything possible to really look like you know what you're doing. No difference like a resume. So your typical initial deposit is roughly 3% of the purchase price, okay? So that's where I put $25,500. If you do the arithmetic of $850,000 times 3%, that gives you an initial deposit of $25,500. Now, you're probably asking, well, Simon, why do we use 3%? Because that's the most that a seller can retain for damages. Meaning that if a seller feels that they were damaged, the buyer's good faith deposit or deposit itself can be up to 3%. So if you really want to define your position and really stand out amongst other offers, you want to have what is called a strong offer. You want to put that you and your client have skin in the game. And when you compel your position by having a deposit that's large, means that the buyer is very serious and has some skin in the game, that they're willing to go forward with this, but more so that you want our offer to be considered. As we scroll down, it's already default. So if we were to uncheck this, then it automatically means, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, that you will wire the $25,500 into escrow within 3 business days of acceptance, okay? So meaning that if your offer gets accepted after all counter offers or any addendums, the buyer has 3 business days to wire the money, draft a cashier's check or a personal check into escrow. If within that 3 days, the buyer fails to provide the deposit, then the seller will have to send a notice to perform. And ultimately, if the buyer does not perform by delivering the deposit, then the seller has the right to cancel. So this is where we're going to talk a little bit about, periods of contingencies and why these contingencies are very, very important in your position. And knowing and understanding the elements of contingencies will help you navigate these offers and the process a lot better, okay? I always recommend having a transaction coordinator because a TC will definitely help you being on your timelines of events. I don't know, Deborah, if there's any questions so far. If not, we'll go ahead and continue.
We do. Okay. One question, I threw it in the chat box there from George Morales. He wanted to know if you have to get an extension all the time. He's saying lenders are taking forever in closing due to COVID.
An extension, yeah, because of COVID, it has definitely revamped in how we do something. And more so right now with appraisal and also with finance involved. This is why you really have to have a very good communications with all your people, meaning your buyer, your lender, your escrow, your title, your home inspectors, and then obviously the lender's appraisal to make sure that everyone is aligned, because if there is a delay, you want to be proactive and engaged to make sure that you have a time frame, because if there is a delay, you may request an extension of time to release a specific contingencies. And we're gonna dive into the contingencies in a moment, but basically a contingency is like a wall, okay? And let's say that there's walls that protect the buyer's deposit. Every wall that you lift allows the seller closer and closer to the buyer's deposit. If the buyer at the end fails to complete the escrow transaction at no fault to the seller, and the buyer has released any and all contingencies, then the buyer may be in jeopardy of forfeiting their deposit. So you got to be very, very careful. Now, with that being said, I'm not here to scare each and every one of you, but I want you to be open and ultimately have a good understanding why these timelines are crucial and the importance of why we do what we do. Because when you have a very systematic approach and understand timelines, then you will be able to have a better conversation with the listing agent if you need that extra time. Because there's so many people involved with this transaction, you want to make sure that everyone is aligned if you need that time frame, but more so if you have to and need that extension to release or even escrow. If 30 days is what you put originally and escrow is not going to close in 30 days, then the recommendation is to be proactive and have an extension of time to close. Because even with that, if you don't close on the date specified, then the seller can send a demand to close and ultimately allow the buyer to be in a position of forfeiting their deposit. So you got to be very, very, very careful when it comes to these time-sensitive timeframes. Okay, I hope that kind of answers your question.
I do have a couple more questions.
Okay.
George is also asking, do you have to add the NA? Can I leave it blank where it is blank?
That's a very good question. Yes, I just put it NA just for the sake of class, but you can definitely leave it blank. I'm a true believer that I like to make sure that I do not miss anything. So I go through the motions of it, of making sure, because there's times that, you know, I might miss something. And if I didn't put an NA to rectify, okay, gosh, I forgot to add that or take that from it. That was the whole purpose. But to answer your question, no, you do not have to put NA. I just do it for reference purposes to kind of give you just for educational purposes as well.
Another question, if we can, I have two more showing. One from Michelle Lee. If buyer misses the 3 business day deposit and seller has the right to cancel, does the seller have right to send the cancellation request the next day? Or the next step for seller must be to send the notice to perform first?
Very good question. So to answer your question, no. A seller cannot just cancel if the buyer has not performed within the 3-day period. So let's just say, for example, offer was accepted today, Monday. Today is considered 0 days on market, okay? Or excuse me, 0 days on escrow, my apologies. So tomorrow being Tuesday would be the first day of a 3-day business days. So today is 0, tomorrow Tuesday would be 1, Wednesday would be 2, and then Thursday would be 3 days. So by the 3rd day on Thursday, if the buyer has not deposited escrow deposit, then the listing agent shall submit a notice to perform. That notice to perform allows the buyer 48 hours to perform, giving them 2 additional more days to make sure that the buyer puts in that deposit. And then after the 48, if the buyer has not fulfilled that requirement, the seller has the right to cancel escrow. Okay.
Well, are you ready for another question? What do you think of putting, this is from Mona, what do you think of putting a deposit for a VA or USDA loans? It's
the same thing. All deposits, when submitting an offer, again, as I mentioned earlier, you want to have a little bit of skin in the game. And you want your offer considered, you want to put a good faith deposit into escrow to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, in good faith, you know, my clients know that they want this property and, you know, they're holding a property for 30 days. Put yourself as a seller and put yourself as a listing agent. If an offer came in with zero deposit, would you consider that as skin in the game? Absolutely not. This is why, the buyer would have to put something into escrow. It doesn't necessarily have to be 3%. Let's say it's a $500,000 price point and the buyer has $5,000 as good faith deposit that they're willing to risk. If the seller accepts that, then by all means, we go in with $5,000. I'm just saying right now, because it's so competitive, we're seeing that on the counter offers that the listing agents grab is that they're asking the buyers, in good faith to put up to 3% into escrow. Now, that's just, what we're seeing right now. But on a normal market, it really depends on what the buyer is willing to, risk. Is it $5,000? Is it $2,000? Or is it $10,000? All I'm saying is, it really depends on the seller and the listing agent of what they want to see. At the end, you'll comply with it or you don't get the offer considered. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Okay, I think that's it for right now.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
I'm sorry, there's one more, Simon, from Mona. If someone used a VA loan and they put 1%, would that money go to the closing costs? Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deborah. Yes, it goes towards the closing costs. So the deposit and down payment, ladies and gentlemen, all goes into the buyer's finance, the down payment and closing costs. So just if, and this is why we break it down. If you look at my scenario here, let me move this real quick. If you look at the scenario is $850,000, the buyer's putting $25,500. Their first loan, which is the amount that they're financing, is $680,000. In my calculations, what I see here is that the buyer is putting 20% down. If you do the arithmetic, 850,000 times 20%, that should give you roughly 170,000. That's the amount that the buyer is putting as down payment, 170. So you subtract the 170, and that gives you the finance amount of 680,000. Okay. So with the deposit of 25,500 and their 170,000 down payment, the buyer at close of escrow, prior to close of escrow, would have to come in with 144,500. If the arithmetic is correct, the 850 on the bottom and the 850 of your purchase price up here has to be the same. If the numbers are off, this number will be off too as well. So make sure that your arithmetic is correct. If the buyer is putting 5%, if the buyer's putting an FHA 3.5%, 10% or 20% or even more, that you calculate, because here's what savvy listing agents see. How much of a down payment are they putting? And then they're going to back it up with, okay, if they're putting 20%, let me see proof of funds in order for me to see that, yeah, they have enough money for not just their down payment, but also enough money for their closing cost as well. Okay. And Deborah, just stop me if you get any questions, because otherwise I'll just continue rumbling.
Okay, no worries.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so now we're almost at the end of the first page of the RPA, where it says additional finance terms. So this is an illustration only where buyers may be asking for closing costs, ladies and gentlemen. This is where, buyer is asking the seller for $10,000, $5,000, $15,000 towards a buyer's non-recurring recruiting closing costs. And this is where you can actually put in the finance terms of request from a buyer to the seller. And again, this is just for illustration purposes, and I wrote that down here as an avenue. This is where you ask for closing costs, okay? If there's no request of closing costs or any finance terms, then we just leave it blank, or you put NA as well, okay? Now going back to the first loan here, you always want to put a interest rate. And the reason is because I see that a lot of agents leave this blank. By leaving it blank, here's the red flag that I see from a buyer or a consumer. Meaning if you leave it blank, then you're saying that whatever the current rate is, that they're still going to qualify. But if you put a specific interest rate, then what it's going to show is that if the interest rate goes above 3.125, then the buyer has some way of backing out of the deal because this is where they want to be and this is where they're comfortable. And again, this is the conversation obviously you're going to be having with the lender is what is the rate that the buyer is going to get? And if they exceed that, that can change the ratios, okay? Where if it climbs and you just don't know, the market is very volatile and it spikes up from 3.25 and it goes up to 3.75 or even 4%. Now their mortgage payment is going to be higher. And they may just not qualify based on those ratios. So my suggestion always is put the interest rate as where they do not want to exceed and cap it there. As a professional myself and a lot of the top agents, that's something that if it's left blank, I would put on a counter offer, buyer to put, buyer shall have the most current rate in term, something to that nature. So that way it specifies that this is not a loophole for the buyer to back out because, they didn't put anything down. So it protects the buyer. If it does increase the rate, this just gives the buyer, well, you know what, I'm not too comfortable. We can either shop the loan or we can say, you know what, due to the increase of the rate, unfortunately, we're just going to back out. Then the buyer has the recourse to cancel, and then the listing agent cannot come back and say, or excuse me, the seller cannot come back and say, well, you know what, you left that blank, and basically leaving it blank means that even if it's at 4 or 5%, you're still going to buy this property, and now you're entangled in a litigation. So just be very, very careful with that, folks. All right, so additional finance, we've gone through it, and then obviously the purchase final, which is $850. All right, I know.
Question before if I can jump in.
Sure.
George is asking, what if the loan has not been funded and you ran out of time for the close of escrow? Will you advise the buyer to deposit the rest of money knowing the loan has been approved?
That's a very good question. Thank you for sharing. Who was that?
George Morales.
George Morales. Thank you, George. That's a very good question. So, no. Escrow will let you know and advise you when the rest of the money needs to be in, and that's usually right after you do your closing package, your loan docs, what we call. So if there is a chance that you're not going to close on time, then this is where you need to ask for an extension of escrow. So if it's a 30-day escrow, but the lender has been bombarded with other stuff that has delay, or the conditions or the underwriter taking a little longer, then my recommendation is send out the send out the ETA form, which is the extension of time addendum to close. And that ETA form allows very specific language that obviously has to be approved by the buyer and the seller, granting that extension. Now, bear in mind, the seller does not have to grant that extension, meaning the seller can say no to the extension and now puts the buyer in a very tight situation or sticky situation. What happens then? Okay, well, if the buyer has not released any and all contingencies, then the buyer unfortunately be forced to cancel. But the good thing is they do not lose their deposit. Okay, so be proactive. And if you need an extension of time, ask it immediately. Don't delegate, or excuse me, don't delay this any more than you should. do it as soon as possible. If there's a delay and you know that, hey, 30 days is just around the corner, you're on the 24th day, and you know that it's going to be a little bit more. And how do you know? From the lender. The lender's going to say, hey, I'm going to need another week. So that's when you need to have that extension in place, send it over, and get the seller to accept the time frame or the extension. Now, you know, I'm a true believer that communication is an important component to any transaction, meaning the dialogue should always be communication on a regular basis. You know, and it starts from the very beginning, because again, I've seen it from my personal experience that a lot of agents go completely silent. Don't be that agent. Be that agent that is on top of your game, okay, and making communications, the good and the bad and the ugly. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. Why I say those different segments is because we love giving good news, right? We don't like giving bad news, and we especially do not like giving, you know, horrible news where you're 29 days into escrow and then the buyer decides to back out of the deal. And now you have to have that heart-to-heart conversation with the agent saying, shoot, you know what? Buyers are not moving forward. They got cold feet, and it's never a good conversation. But here's the bigger picture, folks, okay? Is as professionals, you just got to have the heart to do so, okay? Because that's going to show you who you are as a professional, but also the respect that you're going to get from an agent. In this industry, it's a very tight-knit industry. Everyone knows everyone. You don't want to be that agent that says, oh, that agent does not communicate, that agent does not respond. Give the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's what I always tell my agents is, you know, let's just give the news and then move on to the next. Be a problem solver, be a solution solver, think outside the box, and make it a win-win for all, okay? Any questions so far, Deborah? Or does that kind of answer the question?
I think we're good so far.
Okay.
Thank you.
I know that this class is for about an hour, folks, and I know there's a lot. I cannot do a whole purchase agreement in an hour. I hate to say it. You know, I'm going to try to condense it as much as possible and get through as much as possible in the next 10 minutes or so. But, you know, we will definitely have more classes, and any questions, you know, I'll make sure to put my email if you have any questions, or, you know, speak to your broker as well. Your broker is there to guide you and give you some avenues on how to approach these contracts. All right, let's go quickly on second page. You know, verification of down payment. If you are verifying as part of the condition is you're going to click on here and saying that, you know, the verification of down payment, the 20%, we're submitting it with the offer. All right, appraisal contingencies, again, be very careful. If you are a cash buyer offer, then this is okay to release. But if you're financing any traditional way, conventional, FHA or VA, then do not, and I repeat, do not release this as a condition, because what you're telling the seller is that even if the property doesn't appraise, you know, the buyer will still come in with a difference. So you make an offer for $850, but it comes back at $825. There's a $25,000 discrepancy. If the loan to value, or better known, your LTV, is way high, very tight on those numbers, then the lender will be very hesitant to lend the amount, because one, there's not enough risk. There's not enough risk on the buyer and the down payment. And usually it's the ones that are putting like FHA, very small down payments. When you put 50, 70% down payment, then the lender doesn't see that as a risk factor. And therefore, if you release the appraisal contingency, you know, they're going to be up. But how it works, just for the sake of today's lecture, is the appraised value is what determines the actual finance. As an example, $850 was the offer, appraisal is done, it comes back at $825. then the finance will not be on the 850, it'll be on the 825, and then the 20% from the 825 is calculated, and then that is your number that ultimately is the amount that the buyer will finance. I hope that kind of clears it up, and if not, please let us know. Loan and the appraisal contingency is 17 days, folks, okay? So these are one of many contingencies that I need you to understand, that an appraisal, just as much as disclosures, inspections, and loan, have timelines that need to be removed before continuing on the process. An appraisal contingency is no different. When you release this, then what you're telling is the seller that you're continuing with the process, and that the appraisal came in at value and there's no problem. So it allows 17 days. Now, it also allows you to modify that amount too as well, which, if you want to be aggressive in your position and say that, well, we'll release the contingency in 10 days instead of 17 days. Or, even be more aggressive and say that in 8 days from today, or 8 days from acceptance, the buyer will release this as a condition, okay? But it's already default at 17 days. I stress the fact, leave it if you can at 17 days, because it gives you ample enough time, especially with COVID and so many appraisals running delays and needing extra time. You may not be able to do so within that 17-day period. But it at least gives you the time. Now, I'll get this as well. Well, Simon, what if 17 days is not is here and we still haven't got the appraisal done? Okay, this is why you got to be on top of your game. 2 to 3 days prior to the 17 days, or even sooner, you need to be in communications with the lender and find out what the status of the appraisal. And if the appraisal doesn't look like it's going to be here anytime soon, guess what you need to be doing? You better be drafting that extension of time to release that as a condition, which is the ETA, okay? Don't wait to the last minute, and especially don't wait until the listing agent sends you the notice to perform, because once that happens, then you have very limited time to get this released, and therefore the seller can cancel on you. All right. Loan application, again, if the buyer has not been qualified, it allows 3 days after acceptance. So you don't have to necessarily, based on the contract, have to be pre-approved already. Now, my recommendation, especially right now with the market so hot, you want to be pre-approved or pre-qualified before you're actually showing properties, because a lot of agents will not consider, and a lot of sellers will not consider your offer if you're not pre-approved already for a loan. And if you are, then obviously you're going to attach the letter to it. Loan contingency, which is again default at 21 days. This is probably going to be the last of all your contingencies, and that's the most time frame to release this as a condition. As I mentioned, if it's getting close to that 21 days and you don't see a light on the other side of that tunnel, then you need to ask for an extension to release this as a loan contingency, because once you release loan contingency, then you're pretty much all done. There's no more that the buyer will have to release as part of the process, and therefore, if the buyer does not perform and the seller sends out the cancellation, the seller can go after your buyer's deposit. So be very, very cautious and be very careful when releasing this as a condition, okay? Now, if there is no loan contingency, and that's again an arsenal of dealings, here's the thing. If you are very savvy and you have what we call a great buyer that's putting a substantial down payment, their credit, their job is very stable, their income is great, then you can use a no loan contingency even though you're being financed. Loan contingency doesn't necessarily mean all cash. This can also be used as an aggressive approach to say, hey, my client is solid. my client can qualify for the loan. My client is putting a substantial down payment. The risk factor is very minimal. Therefore, we're going to be an aggressive buyer, and we're going to use this as an avenue to get our offer considered. Then you can use the no loan contingency. Okay, so what that means is obtaining a loan does not specify above is not contingent of this agreement. This doesn't mean it's an all cash offer, ladies and gentlemen. What this means is that your buyer can still get finance involved, but this is not a concern to the buyer because the buyer has substantial backing to qualify for the loan, and you can use this as leverage to get your offer considered and accepted. Okay. I see questions coming in, Deborah. Are we good?
We're good. Somebody had asked, Priya had asked about whether or not the TC completes them, all these documents, and I just typed back to her that the agent will complete them prior to opening escrow. The TC will assist with pulling documents together during escrow. Correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so next section here is this is pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to bypass a little bit and just go where it says other terms, because I know that I get a lot of agents saying, well, what do we put in other terms? Well, here's what I just put. While the RPA is intended as a comprehensive document, it cannot cover all situations, especially those that are not likely to be present in most transactions, okay? So I get this a lot, ladies and gentlemen, is what does this other terms mean? Well, it's modifications. And I have to stress the fact is, and I told you earlier, don't modify a lot of the things. Don't add to it, don't take away from it, because that can ultimately put you in a liability or your clients in a liability. But there's going to be a point in time where it is necessary, and this is why the language is there. This is why paragraph 6 is there as additional terms to specify what the buyer's requesting the seller do, or what the buyer is indicating what the seller wants, what the buyer wants the seller to state. And it can be many factors. Okay, it can be many situation scenarios, and maybe, for example, maybe it's the spa. The spa or the jacuzzi as an example. The buyer fell in love with the jacuzzi, but that's not part of the agreement. The seller was going to take it as not leaving it as part of the deal, but the buyer says, I have to have that spa or jacuzzi there. So the buyer will put that in the contract saying, buyer is requesting as part of the deal or willing to pay for, the jacuzzi. Maybe it's furniture as an example. The house is, and I see this a lot, where the house is completely staged, and the buyer fell in love with all the staging furniture, and they're asking that the seller leave all that as part of the agreement. Or personal, and I'll give you an example that happened to me maybe about 15 years ago. I listed a property, and the seller was moving out to Orange County. The buyer came in here and says, I want the property, but I want all the furniture that's in the home. Just take your personal items, anything that you think is personal, obviously clothing, personal items, but all the furniture, sofa, television, cabinets, dressers, washer and dryer, everything. So literally the seller was, yeah, I'm okay with that because on my new property, I'm going to get new stuff. But part of the agreement was that the seller will consider and accept the offer that the buyer sent with all the furniture on the property. Now it wasn't free. They just increased the purchase price to cover, the cost of all the furniture, and they had really nice furniture that they left behind. But that's a prime example, and that's what we drafted on the on other terms. Buyers requesting that all furniture to stay and remain with the property, and that's okay. I've seen where vehicles are part of and incorporated in the transaction too. Classic vehicle. They submit an offer and they fall in love with the car that's there, and everything is negotiable. And that can be part of the agreement as well. Now, you got to be very careful because one, if it's conventional, you should be okay. But if it's VA, FHA loans, you got to be very cautious because the underwriter is going to say, well, you know, that red flags the underwriter. So you got to be very, very careful. On those notes, do not put it on the purchase agreement. Do a side deal outside of the RPA, because remember, this offer, this document is seen by a lot of people. The lenders, the appraisals, the escrow, the title companies see all this, and you don't want anyone to red flag it, and now it may jeopardize your transaction. Okay. All right, allocation of costs real quickly. This is where, you know, what inspections, reports, certificates, typically your traditional seller pays for natural hazard. I just used SNAP NHD as an example. Now, here's one thing that I get a lot of questions regarding buyers reports or seller reports. Who pays for what? And what should we put on here? Now, many, many years ago, we used to have, and it was incorporated, the termite inspections of Section 1 and Section 2. That used to be part of the agreement. That has been eliminated now because now that's part of the request of repairs. And that request of repairs ultimately is a separate form, which is the RR form. And then the seller has a response to that, which is the response to the buyer's request, which is the RRRR form. Now, remember, I think of ways of not to open up a can of worms that the underwriter will red flag this process or this offer. The least amount of information, the better it is. Stick to the basic information here without, you know, adding too much, because that opens up a can of worms. For example, if you put buyer will get a home inspection, a sewer inspection, roof inspection, now what you're doing is you're exposing that information to the lender. And if the lender asks part of the condition, or the underwriter sees the offer and says, well, the buyer is requesting or has requested an inspection, it's on the RPA. Now that gives the underwriter leverage to say, well, I'm going to need a copy of that inspection. I'm going to need a copy of that sewer inspection. I'm going to need a copy of that roof inspection. And if that roof inspection is thousands of dollars, you know, the lender may be hesitant to lend because they're seeing it as a risk that the buyer may forfeit their position as, you know, months come, and they may not have the income to replace or repair that roof, and they see it as an avenue where, you know, they'll be in default of their mortgage. So I'm not saying that can happen, but I'm saying also it could happen. So you got to be very, very careful. Yes, Deborah.
I have a question. George Morales is asking, why did you mark buyer and seller on allocation costs in 7A2, also in 7A3?
7A2? Okay, I just use it as an example. I'm not saying, because this can be where the buyer is asking for, you know, that the buyer is going to get a home inspection. As an example, buyer will pay for a report of a home inspection. I just used it as illustration, not necessarily that I'm checking it off, because I wasn't sure what I was going to be writing. So that was the whole purpose. Not that I'm putting it as buyer and seller to pay, but it's either or. So the buyer will pay for a home inspection, and let's say that you're asking the seller to pay for a termite inspection, then you would put it here, okay, as illustration, as an example. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, that was the whole thing, because it can be either party. The buyer can pay for it or the seller can pay for it. That's why. But It was just for the sake of the lecture that I was putting both, because I wasn't sure what I was going to be writing, but that's typically what you want. But on that same note, if you can avoid putting that, you can, as illustration of what the buyer plans to do, because you can also say that the seller pay for a sewer inspection, you know, as part of the condition, or the buyer shall pay for the inspection. And this is just the inspection. We're not even going into request or repairs. We're not even going into credits, price reduction. We're just saying who is going to be paying for what inspection reports. That's it. Okay. Section B talks about government retrofits. Again, typically the seller pays for those. The cost of compliance for the minimum the minimum of the conditions under the law usually are paid by the seller. The cost of compliance with the minimum government retro standards, basically who is paying for the reports, and then second, who is paying for those repairs as part of the condition. So one is, okay, who's going to be paying for the inspections or the government? And that can be your low flushing toilets, your smoke detectors, your shower heads, you know, as part of the conditions here in the state of California, or especially Southern California because of the droughts. Those are what that means. Escrow and title. Now, I've seen different verbiage added to it. Traditionally, escrow and title are split between the buyer and the seller. They both incur costs. The buyer incurs costs, the seller incurs costs. So you got to be very careful. You want to check both, because if you only check one or the other, then guess what? What you're saying is that the buyer will even pay the seller's expenses. So you want to make sure that you're clear on this and that you check both of them as part of it. So in this case, escrow and title, each party to bear their own cost. As an illustration, you know, what it says is buyers responsible for their escrow fees and their title fees, and then the seller are responsible for their own bare costs, you know, title and escrow fees as well. Section C2 talks about title insurance. Typically, seller pays for that. Now, a lot of agents will put seller's choice, or you can be creative and say it's either seller's choice, or you can put a specific company. And I think I made an error here. I should have put a title company instead of escrow here. So I apologize for that. Basically, you can put or title company and put the specific title company that you choose. Now, for the most part, a lot of listing agents and sellers want to control all the companies such as title and escrow, but it doesn't hurt, because let's just say that the listing agent is an outside agent. I don't know where everyone is at, but let's just say you're in the West LA area, and the property is located in the South Bay in Torrance. The clients live in the South Bay. It may be more convenient, as long as the listing agent and the seller are okay, to use a title company and escrow that is closer to the subject property. Now, that's far and few. Does it happen? Yeah, it does happen. Does it happen often? No. Usually the listing agent and the sellers take control of title and escrow. But as an avenue, you can add this to the language as well. Seller's choice, or a specific escrow company, seller's choice, or a specific title company. Okay, and then other additional costs, county tax, city tax. It's usually the seller's responsibility. If it's HOA, obviously, if it's a townhome or condominium complex that does have homeowners association fees, then obviously you would request that the seller pay for those costs. And cost of a home warranty, typically the seller can pay for it, or even the buyer can pay for it. But we usually throw it on the seller to pay for a 1-year home warranty. You can choose different affiliates. You have Old Republican, you have American Shield, Fidelity, First America, Home Guard. So it's really a preference and what they can provide your clients with, 1-year home warranty. And what are you requesting? If the property has AC, then you request a home warranty with the AC. Pool, if there's a pool. If there's any other, then you would check off any other stuff as well. Items included in typically, if there's a stove, a washer, dryer, or refrigerator, and you want it as part of this agreement, then you would check this off. And if you don't, then you uncheck it, you leave it blank and not included. If it's only the stove that you want, but you don't want the refrigerator or the washer and dryer, what you're telling the seller is basically, we want you to remove it at time of close of escrow. Do we have questions, Deborah?
I do. I like how you see me pop back in. It's for you.
Yeah.
Michelle Lee is asking you to explain what a private transfer fee might be.
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you. So the private transfer fee, which is this section here, D as in David, section 7, private transfer fee can be many variables. On high-end luxury places such as Beverly Hills, Bel Air, there's a special private transfer fee that those particular cities include on top of your traditional taxes, right? These particular cities have a special private transfer fees because of the high profile areas. You have celebrities, you have high-end athletes in that area. Those areas have what's called security, where they patrol on top of, let's just say Beverly Hills as an example. They have private security as well that roams the area. There's landscaping that protects, the privacy of these residents. These are what we call private transfer fees that if a buyer is taking possession of a property, these are what these additional transfer taxes or assessments that they will incur. And if that's the case, then you always want the buyer to pay these additional fees as part of the offer. I hope that kind of addresses that. And again, you can check by specific cities. Sometimes the listing agent will provide that information. Hey, this property falls under the private transfer fees because it's in a very unique situation, high-end profile location. They incur additional documentation or additional fees. And then if that's the case, then you would check that. I hope that answers the question.
I also had a question, but it got missed. So I was going to ask you, if someone did no loan contingencies, then would they lose their deposit if they couldn't qualify for the loan?
No, that's a very good question. Who's this?
Mona?
Mona. Okay, thank you, Mona. So no, if they release a loan contingency, all they're saying is that, if it's traditional finance or if it's a cash offer, all they're saying is, we're not using that as a contingency. But remember, the buyer can still back out of the transaction due to their due diligence, meaning the buyer getting all the seller disclosures, the buyer doing all their inspections, okay? And if there's something on that inspection done on the property, a physical inspection, the buyer says, okay, you know what, I don't know, this property has a lot of issues. I'm a little concerned with me releasing that as a condition. I think I'm going to back out. Even though you release loan contingency, you still have that as an avenue to back out and cancel escrow. If you're holding on to the appraisal, and let's just say it's a cash offer, if the listing agent is not savvy enough, I would say if the listing agent is super knowledgeable, I would say to the to the buyer's agent and the buyer, you got to release that also as part of the condition. Meaning that if they're going to release loan contingency, by all means, I'm going to incorporate the appraisal contingency as well. But let's just say that the listing agent doesn't release the appraisal contingency, the buyer can still, on a cash offer, get an appraisal. And if the appraisal does not come into the actual purchase price, guess what, Mona? The buyer can back out or negotiate with the seller on those terms. Okay. Also with disclosures, if the seller discloses that part of their transfer disclosure or their seller property questionnaire indicating that, that there's a party every other weekend with the neighbors, you can use that as an avenue to say, well, that's not why I'm buying this property. I don't want the nuisance and the noise. The buyer can back out of it because of that, even if they release loan contingency. Okay, so I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I have another question. Mona, I'm sorry I missed that on the Zoom, but this one is from George Morales. Will you advise the buyer to pay for, and this was following that private transfer fee, would you advise the buyer to pay for it in an offer where there are multiple offer situations?
That's a very good question. It all depends. It all depends because, again, what if that amount is substantial where the buyer's not comfortable with it? And where you can ask is obviously when you opened or you're in negotiations with this, you can ask an escrow officer. They should know, some of the ratifications regarding those transfer or private transfer fees. I would say if you have a relationship with an escrow officer, so say, hey, you know what, I got this client of mine that is interested in making an offer on 123 ABC Street. The listing agent, and on the notations here that there is transfer fees here or private transfer fees. By any chance, you know what those fees are? If it's reasonable, then by all means, then yeah, you know what, use it as an avenue of negotiations. Don't ask the seller to pay for it. Say that the buyer will pay for it, or leave it neutral. Leave it neutral. By leaving it neutral, then the escrow officer is forced to now bring it up to both the buyer and the seller. And you can use that, well, we didn't check it that we were responsible for it. And, the same with the seller. The seller obviously is assuming that the buyer will take it, or the seller will, assume that cost. So you can get this information from your escrow officer. Any other questions?
I think that's it for right now.
Okay. So I see that it's 4:22. So if everyone can just bear for another 10 more minutes, we'll finish up at 4:30. Wherever we finish, that's where we'll finish. Is that fair? Fair enough? All right. So items excluded from the sale. This is where you're asking the seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, unless specified, these are the items that we're asking to exclude out of not part of the sale. So let's just say, for example, that there is a jacuzzi or a spa that you don't want. If there's cabinets in the garage that you just don't want, you can ask for these items to be excluded from the sale. And again, you got to look at it from two different perspectives. Things that are attached to the property and things that are detached from the property. Anything that is considered real property that unfortunately stay with the property, but anything that can be moved, then by all means you can ask and request that the seller remove it as part of the agreement. If you look at what item C says, it says unless otherwise specified, the following items excluded from the sale of the excluded from the sale audio, video components such as flat screen TV, speakers, and other items. If any such items is not listed attached to the property, if a bracket or mechanical attached to the components item, the property furniture and any other secure to the property for earthquake purposes. And number 3, this is where you can also put any other specifics in regards to excluding it from the sale of the property, okay? Brackets attached to walls, floors, or ceilings for any such components, furniture, or items shall remain in the property, or otherwise, if checked, will be removed, and holes or any damage shall be repaired but not painted. So it's very, very clear what it's saying here is that, yeah, the seller's responsible to patch up the holes, but they're not responsible to paint it or match it to whatever the color of the wall is. Okay. Section 9 talks about close and possession. You know, is the buyer intending to occupy the property, or the buyer not intending to occupy the property? You need to just check this. Be very careful, folks. And why I stress the fact that if the buyer's intention is not to live in the property, but they have not checked this because they don't want, and here's the volatile situation that may cause a future issue, is from the lender, especially on FHA or VA loans, because, you know, when the buyer is not intending to live on the property, their interest rate may be a little higher. When the buyer tends to live in the property, they're what we call owner occupied, then their interest rate will be based on them owner occupying and not using it as an investment. So if you know that the intent is for the buyer not to live in the property, but they tell you, you know, let's just leave it that we will be living in the property, be very careful, because now that is a RESPA violation, and you know, you're committing fraud basically, and the buyer can be sanctioned down the line on many variables. So be very, 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 very careful when checking this off. If the buyer intends to live in the property, then you're golden, you know, and if the buyer isn't, then, you know, you need to check this off, because this is, again, something that the lender will see. And, you know, we definitely got to be very careful with that. Section 9B talks about, you know, the time frame of possession. Typically, it's already set for 6 p.m. on the day of close of escrow. Back in the day, the RPA used to say that the buyer had, that the seller had 3 additional days after close of escrow. That has been modified maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, where now it says that the possession will be at close of escrow no later than 6 p.m. Now, it also allows you to, you know, change that if it's earlier time than you would put, you know, by 12 p.m. If that's the request of the buyer, or earlier or later, it doesn't really matter. If you don't do anything, you leave it blank, it already defaults at 6 p.m. You know, you can check off no later than, you know, 2 days or 3 days of possession as well. So that's the beauty of these forms. You can modify them. If you do nothing, leave them blank, it already defaults at 6 p.m. on close of escrow. Okay. All right, let's continue with the next part of it, seller in possession, close of escrow. Now, this is only if you know that the seller will do what's called a rent back, or better known as seller in possession. Then obviously you would check this. Then the SIP form will be created. And this is only if the seller plans to stay on the property after close of escrow. Now, transfer of ownership has already occurred. The buyer is now the owner. The seller is now the tenant. But sometimes they need extra time to either identify a property, or they are moving out of state, and they just cannot do it in 30 days. And this is where the section will be applied, which is the remain in possession after close of escrow. And it says the following: if seller has the right to remain in possession after close of escrow, 1, the parties advised to sign a separate occupancy agreement, which is the SIP, of less than 30 days. So if you know that if you know that the seller will be staying in possession for 30 days or less, then the SIP form must be drafted. If the seller plans to stay more than 30 days, then the form RLAS form must be included, which is the residential lease agreement. Okay, and that can also happen. The reason the seller in possession is very important because it provides additional instructions to both the buyer and the seller on what shall happen after close of escrow. If you do not have a documentation, then you're playing a risk factor where there may be potential liability. So you want to make sure that you're proactive in your position and making sure that the document's in place. If it's less than 30 days, then the seller in possession. If it's more than 30 days, then the residential lease agreement needs to be completed and agreed upon. So that way there's no misunderstanding from either party of what the requirements are, and especially if there's any type of rent back, where the seller is going to be contributing to some type of compensation to the buyer for the purpose of staying after close of escrow. Now, if the property is tenant occupied, then obviously the tenant in possession, the TIP form, the TIP form must be included. And if not, if the tenant is in place, but will be vacating the property, then the agreement is that the property shall be vacant. And this is important to understand, that 5 days prior to close of escrow, the place will be vacated. And again, if there is some modification, especially like the city of Los Angeles, with rent control in the state of California and in specific cities, you know, this 5 day may not be feasible to a potential tenant. This is why you have to have very good dialogue and good understanding of everyone's position, so that way you know how to navigate these conversations. Okay. And with that being said, folks, I think I'm going to cut loose with that today. I apologize that I was not able to complete the entire 32 paragraphs in the RPA, but I hope I was able to at least provide you with some initial value to kind of give you a good understanding on how the RPA works. With that being said, is there any questions you may have? Any questions, even if it's not the questions related to what I've talked about, maybe it's something else that I can help you with.
May I get your contact information, like your phone number?
Absolutely. You can call me directly at 310-465-2321. Hold on, let me double check. I don't even know my direct number. I apologize. Hold on one second. I usually don't call myself, so that's the problem. So here's the number. Call me at this number, 310-465-2320. 310-465-2320. If you have any questions, just call that number. That's the office. Just ask to speak with Simon, and then that'll direct me to my number, or to my call.
Thank you for your time, Simon. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing anything on Facebook other than comments. They say, thank you, Simon. They said it was very informative. You're very thorough. They are appreciative of your time and information, as well as I. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's
awesome,
a lot
Deborah.
to encompass.
Yes, there's a lot of information, folks. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of avenues, and maybe down the line we'll talk about ways of negotiating and little key elements that can help you get your foot accepted. But that'll be in later classes. I hope I get the privilege to to work again with Deborah. Phenomenal. Thank you, Deborah, for spearheading this with me. And again, questions, reach out to me. You can also reach out to me via email at Simon Cazares, that's SIMON CAZ as in zebra, ARES at KW.com as well.
Simon, if I can have just a few more minutes, we had a question come up, and I have one comment. I don't know if you've ever used Forms Tutor, but I like to direct agents to Forms Tutor, and I never paid attention that it's right there in the CAR form as you're working. I've always been in through the CAR website. But for those of you that are watching, that Forms Tutor will have little radio marks that you can go in and see all of the contract breakdown. It just is so thorough. But one question while that's populating, George is asking, even if you released all contingencies in an offer, your buyer doesn't lose deposit, right?
Repeat the question, I'm sorry.
Even if you released all contingencies in an offer, your buyer doesn't lose deposit, right? Was the question.
That's a very good question. So the answer is yes. The buyer may be risking their deposit. Remember, folks, when the buyer releases any and all contingencies, what the buyer is really stating is we're moving forward with the close of escrow. And something may happen that at the end of the stretch of 29 days on a 30-day escrow, the buyer decides to back out. The buyer has released all contingencies. The buyer will most likely forfeit up to 3%. Now, and I mean that when I say up to 3% is because there's protection for the buyer as well. And I've seen it because I've been through litigations, I've been through arbitrations, I've been in lawsuits, and I've seen it go many different parameters. I've seen where the buyer releases all contingencies, everything, and sends the cancellation, granting the deposit to the seller, and then 24 hours later change their mind and says, nope, you know what, I'm not going to sign the cancellation from escrow, and escrow will not release that to the seller, and now it's a fighting feud between the buyer and the seller. I've seen it in every direction. Just because the buyer has released any and all contingencies, does that mean that the buyer will forfeit the entire deposit? Well, technically speaking, based on the purchase agreement, the answer is yes. Yes, but the seller has to challenge and ultimately request that release from escrow. And if the buyer doesn't, the buyer does not agree to that, even releasing that, the buyer may still have a winning chance to receiving some or even all of the deposit. Now, I've got to stress the fact, okay, and I want to be very transparent and crystal clear with this. When doing so, it's a risk, because if you have a very savvy listing agent and a seller that is willing to go after your $20,000, $30,000 deposit, and they get and seek an attorney, then it's going to be very, very hard for you to really say the reason why the buyer should retain their deposit. Now, these contracts is no difference than playing tennis. It's a back and forth. And this is why I stress the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that you have very good dialogue from the very beginning, and you're communicating with the listing agent on a consistent basis, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because if there is a problem that alters your position where you have to cancel, you want to be able to have that relationship with that listing agent that gives you that upper advantage. You become the superhero with your client because you were able to save some of the deposit or save all the deposit because you had that experience with the agent. It's all about communication, folks. It's the ability to know how to navigate not just the contracts, but navigate the conversations with the opposing agent as well. Okay, so with that, I hope it answers your question. If not, you can always send me an email, or you can call me as well. Okay, any other questions?
I don't have any other questions. Were you going to share that Forbes tutor page? Did that populate for you?
Let me see here. Share. Am I sharing my screen or not yet?
You're not right now.
Okay. Okay. Do you see my screen?
It is. Yep.
Okay. All right. So if you go on the very top of your zip forms, form advisory and forms tutorial here. So one thing that I like about the advisory is this. Here it'll take you to the advisory, and there is a couple elements that you can check off. Okay. So for the sake of purchase, making an offer, you click on that, you go through a series of questions. You know, what is it? Is it a seller exclusive? So we'll say buyer. And is the agent a member of the MLS? Yes or no? You know, you go through a series of questions, and then at the end, it'll give you a summary of what forms to use, which you don't have to do any guesswork. the forms that you need. If, it'll tell you need the agency, the possible representation agreement, the wire transfer, the RPA, the buyer advisory. It'll give you the specific forms that you need, because I know that you'll be scratching your head, well, what form do I need to use if I have a buyer consultation? What is the forms that I need to use when I'm submitting an offer, in respect to a single family residence, or if it's a vacant land or a business opportunity? It goes through a series of questionnaires, and then at the end, it'll provide you with the summary that'll give you, and here's some of the questions that you go through in order to get the summary, and then it'll tell you these are the forms that you need. So that's the form advisory. The other one is the form tutorial or tutor. And this is really cool because it gives you a guide. If you go down here where it says for, and this is through the California Association of Realtors, you go access to this. And what's so cool about this is that it gives you specific language. Let's see if it allows me to go in real quick. So what I like about this is that it gives you bullet points of specific contracts. There is, I believe,
I think the screen might have froze. We're still in the contract.
oh, okay. Let me see. Hold on.
Now we're back. The share page is gone.
Okay.
Thank you for taking the time to go over this with them.
No problem. Can you see this now?
Now we can. Yep. Good job. Okay.
So the tutorial form tutor here, what I like about this is that not just the RPA, it gives you a summary for your clients, because when you click on this, they get a link, and then the link will give them exactly what each and every paragraph states. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to do, no, I won't be able to. But let's just say you want to send the RPA as an illustration to the client. If you have a very analytical buyer, you can send this RPA summary by sending them the email. And when they get the email, it'll have this form here. It's not going to allow me to do so. I apologize. But it'll give you that form, and it'll give them specific Q&A. It'll tell them, well, this paragraph is this reason, this paragraph, it's an illustration. It's very, very cool to use as part of your position. Can you still see my screen, Deborah?
Yes, we are still seeing the screen. It's seeing you sign back in.
Yeah, for some reason, it's not allowing me, but let's go back to...
Under Transaction Center at the top of that page you're on right now, it should drop us back down into the tutors.
Okay, this is not what I wanted. Oh, here.
There we go.
So when you check on the advisory or tutor, it'll give you, just a good understanding. And I'm going to go back here. Let's just say that you wanted to know a little bit more of the admit form, right? So can you see this, Deborah?
Yes, perfect.
So what it does is when you click on this, it'll give you a summary of why you're using this particular form, and then it has illustrations, and then you can actually click the play button.
Page 1 specifies the agent's legal obligation as well as that of the buyer of the property. Page 1 also clarifies for a buyer the limits of the...
Yes, we can hear that.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's
I never knew that. That's new for me.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So that's an illustration of what this AVID entails, but it gives you very specific, for the last 20 years, one of the real estate agent's most significant responsibility has been the statutory duty to conduct a reasonable, competent, and diligent visual inspection. So it goes to why are you using this form? And it illustrates, samples of why this particular form is necessary when conducting your visual inspections. So I hope that kind of addresses that. And
good job. Excellent.
More ideas as we progress. This is not the last. There's more to come, folks. this is just one example of so many things that you can use for the purpose of helping build your business. And I strongly encourage and recommend that you go into the California Association of Realtors, because that'll definitely give you an eye opener of some of the tools that you can use for the purpose of running an efficient business for yourself.
Sounds
all right.
good. Thanks, Simon.
Awesome. Thank you all. I appreciate you all. And again, sorry for the technical issue we had earlier, but I hope I was able to address some of the questions we had. So thank you, Deborah, again.
Thank you.
Awesome.